So here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't fully see coming. Because when the lawsuit between Vinnie Vincent and KISS reached its conclusion, when the legal arguments settled and the paperwork replaced the headlines, the expectation from the outside world felt almost automatic, almost predictable, that he would return, that he would rebuild, that he would step back into the industry with something to prove and something to reclaim. But that expectation was built on a pattern that didn't apply here, because what happened next did not follow the familiar rhythm of rise, fall, and redemption. And it did not offer the kind of comeback narrative that audiences are used to seeing, the kind where an artist disappears only to return stronger, louder, and more visible than before. Instead, what followed was something quieter, something slower, and ultimately something far more difficult to define. Because Vinnie Vincent did not come back. He stepped away. And not in a way that created closure, not in a way that allowed fans to process the transition or understand what was happening in real time, but in a way that felt almost gradual, almost invisible, as if the connection between him and the public world of music was not cut, but dissolved. And that distinction matters, because when something dissolves, instead of ending, it leaves behind questions rather than conclusions. Before we move forward, it's important to understand exactly where things stood at the end of that legal chapter, not from a dramatic perspective, not from the emotional lens that fans often bring to these stories, but from a structural standpoint, because the lawsuit filed in July of 1997 was not simply a disagreement, and it was not something that left room for a seamless return. It was about royalties, publishing rights, contractual control, and ultimately the ownership of creative work that had become part of a much larger machine. And when that machine no longer included him, the separation was not temporary. It was definitive. Now think about what that actually means in practical terms. Because when an artist leaves a band like KISS, they are not just stepping off a stage. They are stepping out of an entire ecosystem, one that includes promotion, distribution, touring networks, media visibility, and constant reinforcement of their relevance. And once that connection is gone, rebuilding it is not simply a matter of releasing new music or announcing a tour. It requires re-entering a system that has already moved on, a system that rarely makes space for returns that are not supported by its own structure. And this is where the expectation begins to separate from reality, because the assumption was that Vinnie Vincent would try to come back, that he would release something, that he would reintroduce himself in a way that aligned with that system. But he didn't. He disappeared, and not in a dramatic, headline-driven way, not with a farewell interview or a final performance that marked the end of an era, but quietly, gradually, almost as if the story simply stopped being told. And at first, that absence might have seemed temporary, just another pause in a career that had already seen its share of instability. But as the months turned into years, and the years turned into something longer, it became clear that this was not a pause, it was a complete withdrawal. By 1998, Vinnie Vincent was no longer present in the public music space in any meaningful way. No albums, no interviews, no tours, no visible activity that suggested he was still operating within the industry at all. And in a business that depends on constant visibility, that kind of absence does not go unnoticed. It becomes defining. But here's where the story shifts in a way that changes how you understand everything that follows. Because this wasn't just about career decisions or missed opportunities. It wasn't simply a matter of stepping away from the spotlight. Something else was happening. Something far more personal and far more serious than anything related to music. In 1998, Vinnie Vincent's first wife, Anne Marie Peters, was reported missing. And suddenly, the narrative moved away from contracts and recordings and into something that had nothing to do with the industry at all, something that existed entirely outside the world of performance and public perception. And 2 years later, in 2000, her remains were discovered, and the case would ultimately lead to a conviction. And this is the moment where everything changes, because when something like that enters your life, the idea of rebuilding a music career, the idea of returning to the stage, the idea of maintaining public visibility, all of it becomes secondary. All of it shifts in importance. And whatever connection existed between you and your previous life begins to fade, not by choice, but by circumstance. And this is where the story stops feeling like a rock documentary and starts feeling like something else entirely. Because what you are looking at now is not a musician making strategic decisions about their career. It is a person navigating events that fundamentally alter their reality, events that reshape priorities and redirect focus in ways that no industry plan could ever account for. And when you combine that with the fallout of the lawsuit, the loss of structural support, and the absence of a system that keeps artists visible, the silence that follows is no longer surprising. It becomes understandable. As the 2000s move forward, that silence remains consistent, uninterrupted, almost absolute. No albums released under his name, no tours, no mainstream appearances, no visible attempt to re-enter the industry in the way that other former members of KISS continued to do. And in an industry where visibility is currency, where presence determines relevance, that kind of absence does not just remove you from the conversation, it erases you from it. But here's something worth paying attention to, because even in that absence, the music itself did not disappear, the influence did not vanish. And in 2008, a tribute album titled Kiss My Ankh was released, performed by other musicians who recognized the impact of his work and chose to reinterpret it. And on the surface, that might seem like a continuation of his legacy, a sign that his contributions were still valued, still remembered, still relevant. But look closer, because he wasn't the one performing it. He wasn't actively part of that continuation. And when other artists are keeping your music alive while you remain absent from the process, it creates a separation between the legacy and the individual. And over time, that separation becomes harder to bridge. And then, just when you think the distance couldn't grow any larger, the timeline introduces another layer, another event that reinforces the pattern rather than interrupts it. In 2014, Vinnie Vincent's second wife, Diane Kiro, passed away due to alcohol-related complications. And once again, the story shifts away from music and back into something deeply personal, something that adds weight to the silence rather than explaining it away. And at this point, the pattern becomes clear, not in terms of career strategy, but in terms of life events that shape everything around them. Because this is no longer just about a musician who stepped away from the spotlight. It is about a life shaped by circumstances that extend far beyond the industry. And then, after nearly 2 decades, something changes. In January of 2018, Vinnie Vincent reappears publicly at the Atlanta KISS Expo, his first public appearance in over 20 years. And for those who had followed his story, who had watched his absence stretch across decades, this moment carried a weight that went beyond nostalgia. It felt like a return. He spoke, he performed, he engaged with fans who had not seen him in decades. And for a moment, it felt as if the connection that had been lost was being restored. As if the story that had faded into silence was being brought back into focus. There was even a public reconnection with Simmons, something that added another layer of significance to the moment, because it suggested that at least on the surface, some of the tension from the past had softened. And naturally, expectations followed. Because this is the point where most comeback stories begin. This is where momentum builds, where announcements are made, where the return becomes something tangible and sustained. But that's not what happened here, because what followed did not match those expectations. Plans were made for live performances, concerts that would mark a full return to the stage, events that would transition him from fan conventions back into the traditional structure of touring and performance. But those plans didn't hold. They were postponed, then cancelled, and replaced with something much smaller, much more controlled: fan events, private gatherings, experiences that focused on direct interaction rather than large-scale exposure. And this is where the narrative changes again, because instead of rebuilding a traditional music career, Vinnie Vincent began operating in a different space entirely, one that did not rely on the conventional model of touring and promotion, but instead centered around control over access, control over visibility, control over how and when the audience engages with what he creates. And that distinction matters, because it defines everything that comes next. Moving into the 2020s, his activity continues, but in the same controlled pattern: archival releases, demo collections, previously recorded material being revisited and presented in new ways, rather than a full-scale mainstream return. In 2022, he appears at Creatures Fest alongside Ace Frehley and Bruce Kulick, a moment that connects multiple eras of KISS history in one place. And for fans, that moment carries meaning. But even then, the pattern does not change. No major tour follows. No large-scale comeback is announced. No sustained re-entry into the mainstream industry takes place. Instead, what you see is consistency, but not in the way you might expect. Consistency in restraint, consistency in limitation, consistency in maintaining a distance from the traditional structures that define most music careers. In 2023, he hosts a private listening event at Starstruck Studios, offering fans access to new material in a setting that emphasizes exclusivity rather than reach. And by this point, the structure becomes clear, because what you are seeing is not a comeback in the traditional sense. It is a redefinition of what it means to be active in the music world without fully participating in the system that defines it. A redefinition of how music is shared, how it is accessed, and how the relationship between artist and audience is structured. And this is where the conversation shifts again, because when an artist chooses this kind of path, when they move away from wide accessibility and toward controlled engagement, it changes expectations, it raises questions, and it creates division. Because not everyone sees this as a return, and not everyone agrees on what it represents. And that brings us to the present, because after everything, the lawsuit, the silence, the personal losses, the reappearance, the limited events, the archival releases, Vinnie Vincent is once again creating new material. But this time, the conversation surrounding that material is not just about the music itself, it is about something else entirely. Because in 2026, the focus is shifting away from whether he has returned and toward how he has chosen to return. And this is where things become controversial, because what he is doing now does not follow the traditional model. It does not align with the expectations that fans have for a comeback, and it forces a different kind of question, not just about the music, but about access, about value, and about who that music is actually for. Because when control becomes the central theme, when access is limited, when engagement is structured in a way that prioritizes exclusivity, the relationship between artist and audience changes. And that change is not always easy to accept, because this is no longer just a story about a guitarist who left KISS and tried to rebuild his career. This is a story about how that career evolved outside the system, how it reshaped itself, and how it now exists in a form that challenges expectations rather than meeting them. And that leads directly into what comes next. Because in Part 5, we're not just looking at the music, we're looking at the pricing, the access, and the reaction, and what all of that reveals about where Vinnie Vincent stands today, and whether this is truly a comeback or something else entirely.